"You are not good enough for my daughter." The words landed in the middle of the dining room with the kind of silence that made every fork stop moving at once. Margaret Parker never raised her voice, yet every guest around the polished oak table heard every syllable as clearly as if they had been rehearsed. Ethan Brooks didn't answer immediately. He simply looked at her, calm, composed, his hands resting lightly beside the engagement ring box he had not even opened yet. "Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change. And we're glad you're here." Now, back to Ethan Brooks. The Parker family had gathered in their spacious suburban home outside Boston for what Emily Parker believed would become one of the happiest nights of her life. She had imagined laughter, warm congratulations, and maybe even a few happy tears. Instead, the room felt colder than the December wind pressing against the windows. Margaret folded her arms without taking her eyes off Ethan. She studied his simple navy blazer, his plain white shirt without a designer logo, and the modest watch on his wrist. In her mind, everything about him confirmed the conclusion she had already reached before he ever walked through her front door. Across the table, Emily's older brother, Daniel, exchanged a knowing smirk with his wife. Her father, Richard, quietly lowered his coffee cup without saying a word. No one rushed to defend Ethan. No one challenged Margaret's judgment. The silence itself became another accusation. Emily looked from her mother to Ethan, her heartbeat racing. "Mom, please," she whispered, hoping the conversation could still be saved before it broke beyond repair. Margaret shook her head. "Love doesn't pay bills. Good intentions don't build futures. My daughter deserves stability, respect, and someone who can stand beside her in every room." Ethan listened without interrupting. He had heard different versions of those words since he was a teenager. Sometimes they came from strangers. Sometimes from business executives. Tonight they came from the woman whose blessing he had hoped to earn. Yet his expression never changed. It was the same steady look that had carried him through closed doors, skeptical faces, and opportunities that vanished the moment people saw the color of his skin before they saw his character. Emily reached for his hand beneath the table. He gently squeezed her fingers, silently asking her not to argue. That quiet gesture puzzled everyone watching. Daniel leaned back in his chair with a faint laugh. "You know, Ethan, this doesn't have to be embarrassing. Maybe you should just accept that some relationships aren't realistic." A few uncomfortable glances circled the room, but still no one stopped him. Ethan slowly lifted his eyes toward Daniel before looking back at Margaret. His voice remained soft enough that everyone leaned in to hear it. "May I ask you one question?" Margaret nodded cautiously. "Do you believe someone's worth can truly be measured the first time you meet them?" She hesitated for only a second before answering. "Sometimes it can." Ethan gave the slightest nod, not because he agreed, but because he understood exactly what she believed. The evening had just changed, and although no one at that table realized it yet, one forgotten photograph hidden somewhere inside this house was already waiting to tell a story that none of them would ever forget. Ethan did not reach for the small velvet ring box resting beside his plate. Instead, he folded his hands together and allowed the silence to settle naturally, almost as though he believed every person in the room deserved the chance to hear their own thoughts before hearing his. Margaret interpreted that silence as surrender. Daniel mistook it for weakness. Richard assumed it was embarrassment. Only Emily recognized the expression on Ethan's face. She had seen it before during difficult moments when other people expected him to defend himself. He never rushed. He never competed with anger. He simply waited until emotions revealed more than words ever could. Margaret pushed her chair back a few inches and crossed the dining room toward the sideboard where family photographs filled polished silver frames. She picked up one, smiled briefly at the picture inside, then looked back at Ethan. "Our family has always worked hard for everything we have," she said. "Emily was raised with values. She deserves someone who can offer certainty." Ethan answered with the same calm tone. "Every parent wants that for their child. The response caught Margaret slightly off guard. She had expected excuses. She had expected promises. Instead, she received agreement. Daniel leaned forward, resting both elbows on the table. Then maybe you understand why this is not personal. We barely know you. You show up in a regular car, wearing clothes anyone could buy at a department store, asking to marry my sister. We are supposed to trust that? Ethan looked toward him with quiet respect. Trust is earned over time. I agree with that too. Daniel laughed softly. At least you are realistic. Emily shook her head. You are all making assumptions about someone you have not even tried to know. Richard finally spoke, his voice measured and careful. Emily, your mother is worried about your future. That is all. Ethan glanced toward Richard and gave a slight nod. A father should worry about his daughter. I would probably do the same one day. Again, his answer refused to create an argument. The dining room felt strangely unbalanced because every criticism seemed to disappear instead of finding something to strike. Margaret studied him more carefully now. She had prepared herself for confidence that bordered on arrogance or resentment that exploded into accusations. Instead, she found neither. There was only patience. The grandfather clock in the hallway marked another minute. Outside, light snow drifted across the front yard, covering the sidewalks in quiet white. Inside, every passing second seemed to increase the discomfort around the table. Emily reached for a glass of water with trembling fingers. She wanted to tell her family everything she knew about Ethan, but every time she opened her mouth, he gently met her eyes and almost imperceptibly shook his head. He did not want his worth explained by someone else. Margaret noticed the silent exchange. You asked her not to tell us something, did not you? She asked. Ethan answered honestly. I asked Emily to let you meet me before hearing anything about me. Margaret frowned. Why would anyone do that? Ethan looked around the room, taking in every face before answering. Because I wanted to know whether I would be judged by my character first or by something else. No one answered. The room grew still once again, but this silence carried a different weight. For the first time that evening, Margaret found herself questioning not Ethan, but the certainty of her own first impression. The conversation should have ended there, but instead it spread across the dining room like a slow-moving storm that no one seemed interested in stopping. Margaret returned to her chair without taking her eyes off Ethan. Whatever uncertainty had briefly crossed her face disappeared behind years of confidence in her own judgment. She folded her napkin carefully and spoke as though she were explaining something obvious. Character matters, Ethan. I agree with that. But character alone does not build a life. Emily has worked too hard to settle for uncertainty. Ethan listened quietly. I would never ask her to settle for anything less than she deserves. Daniel smiled with unmistakable disbelief. That sounds nice, but words are free. He leaned back and looked toward his father. Dad, ask him what he does. We have danced around it long enough. Richard looked across the table. What line of work are you in, Ethan? Emily looked at Ethan, silently hoping he would simply answer and end the assumptions once and for all. Instead, he offered only a gentle smile. I work in business. Daniel laughed under his breath. Business is a pretty convenient answer. His wife, Lauren, added, everybody says they are in business when they do not want to be specific. Emily finally could not stay silent. He has never lied to me. Margaret answered before Ethan could speak. No one said he was lying. We are saying we do not know enough. Yet the questions kept coming. What neighborhood did he live in? What kind of company did he work for? Did he rent or own? Why had he arrived alone? Why did he drive an ordinary sedan instead of something more impressive? Every question sounded polite on the surface, but together they formed a picture that Ethan recognized immediately. He had seen it in conference rooms, luxury hotels, country clubs, and charity events. People often search for tiny details that confirmed what they had already decided to believe. Years earlier, when Ethan was only 24 years old, he had walked into a downtown office wearing the only suit he could afford. A receptionist had assumed he was there to deliver packages instead of leading the investment meeting everyone had been waiting for. She had apologized later, but Ethan never forgot how quickly appearances became conclusions. Standing in the Parker dining room, the feeling returned with remarkable clarity. Different house. Different people. The same quiet assumptions. Emily reached for his hand once more. This time Ethan gave her a reassuring smile before looking back at her family. "I appreciate your concern for Emily," he said calmly. "It tells me how deeply you love her." Margaret seemed surprised by the answer. "You are not offended?" Ethan shook his head slowly. "Being judged too quickly is disappointing. Love is not." His words lingered in the room longer than anyone expected. Daniel looked away first, uncomfortable for reasons he could not explain. Richard stared into his coffee cup, reflecting more than speaking. Emily felt tears beginning to gather in her eyes, not because Ethan had defended himself, but because he refused to attack anyone in return. Upstairs, beyond the hallway and past a narrow staircase, an old storage room held dozens of forgotten boxes filled with family keepsakes collected over 3 decades. Margaret had no idea that before this evening was over, one of those forgotten boxes would force her to question every certainty she had carried into this dinner and every opinion she had formed about the quiet man sitting across from her. Emily slowly stood from her chair, the sound of its legs brushing against the hardwood floor breaking the heavy silence that had settled over the room. She looked first at her father, then at her brother, and finally at her mother. There was disappointment in her eyes, but there was also determination. "You asked me to bring the man I love home because you wanted to know him," she said quietly. "Tonight none of you have tried." Margaret sighed as though the conversation had become exhausting. "Emily, we are trying to protect you." Emily shook her head. Protection without understanding becomes judgment. Daniel folded his arms. "You are letting your emotions make decisions for you." "No," Emily answered. "I am asking all of you to stop making decisions before you know the facts." Ethan remained seated. He did not interrupt. He did not attempt to rescue Emily from the difficult position she found herself in. He respected that this was her family and that every relationship around the table carried years of history long before he entered the picture. Richard finally leaned back and spoke with measured concern. "Emily, if this relationship is as serious as you say it is, then surely Ethan understands why your mother has questions." Ethan nodded immediately. "She has every right to ask questions." Margaret looked at him with growing confusion. "Then why do you refuse to answer them?" Ethan smiled gently. "Because some answers only change opinions. They do not change hearts." Those words lingered in the dining room. Even Daniel had no quick response. Outside, the snowfall became heavier, covering the driveway and the front lawn with a fresh layer of white. Inside, the warmth from the fireplace contrasted sharply with the emotional distance growing around the dinner table. Margaret stood once more and gathered a few empty plates, more to occupy her thoughts than to help clean the table. As she carried them toward the kitchen, her eyes drifted toward the staircase leading to the second floor. "There is something upstairs Emily has wanted to show everyone for months," she said almost absent-mindedly. "The old family memory box. It has photographs from every stage of our lives." Emily managed a faint smile. "I almost forgot about it." Margaret nodded. "Perhaps looking through happier memories will remind us that family decisions should never be rushed." Without waiting for anyone to answer, she disappeared toward the staircase. The sound of her footsteps echoed softly through the quiet house before fading into the second-floor hallway. Ethan watched her leave without speaking. Something about the way she had mentioned the old photographs caught his attention, although he could not explain why. Emily returned to her seat and looked apologetically at him. "I am so sorry," she whispered. Ethan reached across the table and gently held her hand. "You have nothing to apologize for." They should have listened. Sometimes people cannot truly listen until life places the right memory in front of them. Emily searched his face, wondering why he sounded so certain. Upstairs, Margaret entered the small storage room beneath the sloped roof. Shelves lined the walls, filled with labeled boxes, holiday decorations, and albums that had not been touched in years. She brushed a thin layer of dust from a large cedar box marked Family Memories and carefully lifted the lid. Inside were dozens of envelopes, newspaper clippings, handwritten notes, and photographs collected across 3 decades. She smiled as she reached for the oldest stack, completely unaware that hidden among those fading pictures was one forgotten moment that would soon challenge everything she believed about the quiet man waiting downstairs. Margaret carried the cedar memory box downstairs with both hands, setting it carefully on the coffee table in the living room as everyone gradually left the dining room behind. The tension had not disappeared, but it had changed shape. No one was arguing anymore. Curiosity had quietly replaced confrontation. Emily knelt beside the box and smiled faintly as Margaret lifted the lid. Inside were neatly stacked photo albums, birthday cards, postcards from family vacations, and dozens of loose photographs that had faded around the edges after years of being tucked away. Richard sat down on the sofa, adjusting his reading glasses while Daniel leaned against the fireplace with folded arms. Ethan remained standing a respectful distance away, giving the family space to revisit memories that belonged to them. Margaret picked up one photograph after another, smiling as she recalled Emily's first day of kindergarten, Daniel's high school graduation, and an old 4th of July picnic by the lake. For a few brief moments, laughter returned to the room. The atmosphere softened enough that Emily almost believed the evening might recover. Then everything changed. Margaret reached into the bottom corner of the box and pulled out a worn envelope that had not been opened in years. A single photograph slipped onto the hardwood floor. She bent down to retrieve it, but the moment her fingers touched the picture, she froze. Her breathing slowed. The color gradually disappeared from her face. She stared at the image without speaking. Richard noticed first. "Margaret?" he asked quietly. She did not answer. Her eyes remained fixed on the faded photograph as though the years between then and now had suddenly disappeared. Daniel stepped closer. "Mom, what is it?" Still no answer. Emily walked over carefully. "Are you all right?" Margaret finally whispered, almost to herself, "No. That cannot be possible." Everyone looked toward the picture, but from where they stood, only Margaret could clearly see it. The image showed a rainy afternoon nearly 20 years earlier. A younger Margaret stood beside a disabled sedan on the shoulder of a quiet highway outside Hartford. Beside her was a smiling African-American family offering help. The father held an umbrella. The mother carried a small cooler. Between them stood a young boy, no older than 10, wearing a bright blue jacket and smiling directly at the camera. Margaret's hands began to tremble. She slowly lifted her eyes from the photograph and looked across the room at Ethan. Then she lowered them back to the picture again. She repeated the motion several times, comparing the gentle eyes, the familiar smile, and the unmistakable expression that time had matured but never erased. Emily noticed the change in her mother's face. "Mom, what are you seeing?" Margaret swallowed hard, her voice barely audible. "I know that face." Ethan stood perfectly still. He had not yet seen the photograph, but something in Margaret's expression told him that the evening had reached a place none of them expected. Richard rose from the sofa and carefully accepted the picture from his wife. His own expression shifted from confusion to disbelief within seconds. Daniel stepped beside him, studying the image before turning slowly toward Ethan. For the first time that evening, no one was looking at him with suspicion. They were looking at him with questions they had never imagined asking. Margaret took one hesitant step forward, holding the photograph close to her chest. "Ethan," she said softly, have we met before?" The question hung in the room with extraordinary weight. Margaret's voice was barely louder than a whisper, yet everyone heard it. Ethan looked at the faded photograph in Richard's hands for the first time. He stepped closer slowly, careful not to rush the moment. The instant his eyes settled on the picture, a quiet smile appeared, followed by a look of deep reflection. He gently nodded. Yes, he said. I remember that day. No one moved. Even the crackling fireplace seemed quieter. Margaret covered her mouth with trembling fingers. You were that little boy. Ethan looked at the photograph again. I was 10 years old. Richard stared at him in disbelief. What happened? Ethan took a slow breath before answering. My parents and I were driving back from visiting my grandmother in Connecticut. It had been raining most of the afternoon. We saw a car stopped on the shoulder with its hazard lights flashing. My father always believed that if someone needed help and you could help safely, you stopped. Margaret closed her eyes as memories she had not revisited in years came rushing back. She remembered standing beside her disabled car while the rain soaked through her coat. Her cellular phone had lost its signal. She had been frightened, exhausted, and completely alone. Then another vehicle had pulled over. A kind man stepped out carrying an umbrella while his wife brought blankets from the back seat. Their young son smiled warmly and offered Margaret a bottle of water without saying a word. Ethan continued softly. Your battery had failed. My father helped another driver connect jumper cables. My mother stayed with you because you were cold and shaken. We waited until your engine started and another motorist confirmed that you could safely reach the next service station. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. I remember your parents refusing the money I offered. Ethan nodded. My father smiled and said that kindness was never something you put a price on. Richard lowered the photograph slowly. Daniel looked from the picture to Ethan as if seeing him for the first time. Emily stood completely still, overwhelmed by a story she had never heard before. Margaret spoke through a trembling voice. I carried this photograph because I wanted to remember the family that helped me. I always hoped I might thank them again someday. Ethan smiled gently. We never expected to meet again. My parents simply believed that helping someone was the right thing to do. Margaret looked at him with growing disbelief. Every assumption she had made only an hour earlier now echoed painfully in her own mind. She had questioned the character of the very man whose family had shown her compassion during one of the most vulnerable afternoons of her life. The room no longer felt divided between strangers. Instead, it felt like a place where forgotten memories had quietly returned to demand honesty. Ethan did not mention success, wealth, or achievement. He did not remind anyone of the harsh words spoken earlier that evening. He simply looked at Margaret with the same calm expression he had carried since walking through the front door. That quiet grace made the silence even heavier because everyone in the room understood the same truth at exactly the same moment. The greatest measure of a person had been sitting at their table all evening, and none of them had recognized it. No one spoke for several long seconds. The silence was no longer uncomfortable because of disagreement. It was heavy with realization. Margaret slowly lowered herself into the nearest chair, still holding the faded photograph as though letting go of it might somehow erase the truth it had revealed. She looked at Ethan with eyes completely different from the ones that had greeted him at the front door. The certainty had vanished. In its place was humility. I owe you more than an apology, she said quietly. Ethan gently shook his head. You do not owe me anything from that day. My parents never expected gratitude. Margaret swallowed hard. Maybe not. But tonight I judged the son of the people who showed me kindness when they had every reason to keep driving. Richard walked toward Ethan and extended the photograph. Would you like to keep this? Ethan smiled warmly before handing it back. No. It belongs with your family's memories. I already have mine. Emily looked at him with quiet admiration. She had often wondered why Ethan never rushed to defend himself when people underestimated him. Now she finally understood. His confidence had never depended on winning arguments. It came from knowing exactly who he was long before anyone else did. Daniel cleared his throat, his voice noticeably softer than before. There is still something I do not understand. You avoided every question we asked tonight. Why? Ethan looked around the room before answering. Because if I had listed accomplishments the moment I walked through the door, everyone would have treated me differently for the wrong reason. Richard frowned slightly. What do you mean? Ethan reached into the inside pocket of his blazer and removed a simple leather business card holder. He placed a single card on the coffee table without any dramatic gesture. Daniel picked it up first. His eyes widened almost immediately. He read the name once. Then again, more slowly. The room became silent all over again. Richard accepted the card next. His expression shifted from confusion to complete disbelief. Margaret stared at both men before finally taking the card herself. Embossed beneath Ethan Brooks's name were the words Chief Executive Officer, Brooks Capital Holdings. Emily smiled gently. I wanted to tell you weeks ago, she admitted. He asked me not to. Margaret looked back at Ethan, struggling to reconcile the quiet man before her with the title she had just read. You lead this company? Ethan nodded calmly. For the past 6 years. Daniel looked astonished. The company that just acquired 3 regional manufacturing firms? Yes. Richard slowly lowered the card. I have read about your company for years. Ethan smiled politely. Then you know it has never really been about me. Thousands of people work there. I simply have the privilege of serving them. Margaret closed her eyes for a brief moment. Earlier that evening she had assumed Ethan had nothing to offer her daughter because of the clothes he wore, the car he drove, and the quiet way he carried himself. Yet none of those assumptions had reflected reality. Ethan had never hidden the truth. He had simply refused to use success as a shortcut to respect. Looking around the room, he spoke with the same calm voice that had never once risen above conversation. Titles can open doors, he said. But if someone only values me after reading my business card, then they never truly saw me in the first place. No one had an answer because every person in the room understood that the greatest revelation of the evening was not that Ethan was a successful chief executive officer. It was that his character had remained exactly the same before anyone knew it. Margaret held Ethan's business card in both hands as though it weighed far more than a piece of paper ever could. The title printed beneath his name had surprised her, but it was not what broke her heart. What haunted her was the memory of her own words only an hour earlier. She had looked into the eyes of a man whose family had once shown her extraordinary kindness and decided he was not worthy of her daughter before she had even asked him a single sincere question. Slowly she stood and walked toward Ethan. The room remained completely silent. Richard watched with quiet concern. Daniel lowered his eyes. Emily held her breath. Margaret stopped only a few feet away and looked directly at Ethan. Tears gathered in her eyes as she struggled to find the right words. I spent years telling my children that character mattered more than appearances, she said softly. Tonight I failed to live by my own lesson. Ethan listened without interrupting. I saw your clothes before I saw your heart. I saw your skin before I saw your story. I believed my first impression instead of giving you the respect every human being deserves. I am deeply sorry. Her voice trembled as she continued. And what makes it even harder to accept is knowing that your family once treated me with compassion when I had absolutely nothing to offer them in return. Ethan's expression remained gentle. My parents would want you to forgive yourself after learning from it. Margaret slowly shook her head. Your parents raised an extraordinary man. Richard stepped forward and placed a reassuring hand on his wife's shoulder. Ethan, I owe you an apology as well. I remained silent when I should have spoken. Silence can support unfair judgment just as easily as harsh words. Ethan nodded respectfully. It takes courage to say that. Daniel took a slow breath before stepping away from the fireplace. Earlier that evening his confidence had filled every corner of the room. Now humility had replaced it. I judged you because I thought I could read your entire life in the first 30 seconds. I was wrong. He offered his hand without hesitation. Ethan accepted it with a warm smile. There was no resentment in his eyes, only quiet understanding. Emily watched the exchange with tears of relief. The tension that had surrounded the evening since Ethan first entered the house finally began to dissolve. Margaret looked toward her daughter. "Emily, I almost allowed my fear and my prejudice to cost you the chance to build a life with someone whose integrity is greater than anything money can buy." Emily embraced her mother gently. "Thank you for saying that." Margaret then turned back to Ethan. "Whether you had been a chief executive officer or a schoolteacher or a mechanic should never have changed the way I treated you. The mistake was mine long before I learned your profession." Ethan smiled softly. "That is the reason I never introduced myself by my title. Respect that depends on success is temporary. Respect that begins with dignity lasts much longer." Richard looked around the living room filled with family photographs and quietly said, "Tonight those old pictures reminded us who we wanted to be. Ethan reminded us who we still can become." The house felt different now. Not because anyone had discovered that Ethan led a successful company, but because every person in the room had finally seen the quiet strength that had been sitting among them from the very beginning. The evening that had begun with doubt slowly transformed into something none of them could have planned. Snow continued to fall outside the Parker home, covering the streets in quiet white while warmth finally returned inside. Margaret carefully placed the old photograph back into its envelope, but this time she did not hide it beneath the other memories. She laid it on top of the cedar box where everyone could see it. It no longer represented a forgotten afternoon from years ago. It had become the reminder that changed an entire family in a single night. Richard smiled as he looked toward Ethan. "If you are still willing," he said, "I would like to hear your plans for the future. Not because of your company. Because you are the man my daughter loves." Ethan smiled with genuine gratitude. "That is the conversation I hoped we would have from the beginning." Emily laughed softly through lingering tears, and for the first time that evening the room felt like home instead of a courtroom. Daniel walked into the kitchen and returned a few moments later carrying fresh coffee for everyone. Earlier he had viewed Ethan as someone who needed to prove his worth. Now he served him with the same respect he offered every member of his own family. The change was quiet, almost invisible, but it was real. Margaret looked around the room before speaking one final time. "Tonight I learned that prejudice does not always arrive with anger. Sometimes it arrives disguised as concern, assumptions, or confidence that we already know enough about another person. I never want to make that mistake again." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "The hardest bias to recognize is the one we believe is reasonable. That is why kindness matters. It slows us down long enough to see people clearly." Emily reached into Ethan's hand and gently placed the small velvet ring box back into his palm. He looked at her with surprise. She smiled. "You never had the chance to finish what you came here to do." Ethan stood, taking a slow breath before turning toward Richard and Margaret. "I came here because I love your daughter. I hoped for your blessing, but I knew it could not be demanded. Respect is always a gift." He then looked at Emily, opened the ring box, and asked with the same quiet confidence that had carried him through the entire evening, "Emily Parker, will you marry me?" Tears filled her eyes as she answered without hesitation. "Yes. Absolutely yes." Margaret embraced both of them, followed by Richard and then Daniel. The walls that had separated strangers only hours earlier disappeared, replaced by honesty, humility, and understanding. Before everyone gathered for one final family photograph, Margaret picked up the old picture once more and placed it beside the new one they had just taken together. One image captured a family offering kindness to a stranger on a rainy highway. The other captured two families brought together because kindness had found its way home. As Ethan looked at both photographs resting side by side, he smiled and spoke the words that no one in the room would ever forget. "A title can earn admiration. Money can earn attention. Success can earn recognition. But character is the only thing that earns trust when no one knows your name." Never decide someone's worth before you learn their story, because the person standing quietly in front of you may already have changed your life long before you ever knew who they were.